which is good. We got questions about Teslas and batteries. Let's start on that one, which is how green is the mining of the lithium battery materials, please? Because if the battery can't last the life of the vehicle, how about disposal and replacement of the batteries? And also, while we're on that one, there's a question about the infrastructure for recharging electric vehicles as well. So let's have a question on electric vehicles.
Brilliant questions, for which thank you. And let me go right to the heart of that sort of battery mining. There are significant problems with how the minerals that use, not just in batteries, but a lot of the low carbon electric future bring with them. Anybody who's seen how cobalt is extracted through, in effect, slave labor in the Democratic Republic of Congo, none of those words of which are accurate, understands the scale of the problem. There is no perfect pathway forward, and the problems with that have to be put right. Now, I'm seeing two things. One is that the big tech companies are starting to take responsibility for the metals extracted many steps back in their own value chains, in the way that the supermarket had to do the same in terms of the soy animal feed 6 or 7 stages away from 10 years ago. So it's starting to happen. The second thing I'm seeing is more and more recycling. So when batteries are finished with, people are no longer throwing them away. They're either using the battery to put into a home where you can store the energy collected from your solar roof to be used at a different time in your house using old car batteries. I'm also seeing the great steps in innovation, chemistry right at the very heart of it. I'm proud of that. I'm a chemist, where for the first time we're going to have a 1,000,000-mile battery. So the battery will actually far outlast an internal combustion engine, and probably will outlast the exterior of the car itself. So I don't think the battery itself is the long-term problem. Making sure that the supply chains are run responsibly in the future absolutely is. And the businesses like Tesla need to put those things right. Spot on. On the second question on infrastructure, absolutely. So I now see we had 3 big challenges when it came to the uptake of electric cars. One, they were seen as too expensive, and therefore everything I'll show you about the battery price coming down, big benefit. Secondly, they were seen as performing badly in conventional car terms. Now most electric cars will outperform an internal combustion engine. The third great challenge that remains is range anxiety. You leave your home, you can't stop a petrol station just to fill up in the way that you used to do. Help. And for a lot of people, don't have a drive to recharge overnight. It's doubly difficult. Now, dot charging infrastructure is starting to go into place. I've just seen the first grid serve forecourt going in place around in Essex, just off the M25. 24 charging points, which will typically give you a full recharge in 20 to 30 minutes. That's still too long for most people. I've just seen a battery breakthrough this morning, actually, which will get you 100 miles of charge into your battery within 5 minutes. Not much longer than you would stop at a petrol station anyway. So all the time that is coming, but that's one thing that business and government need to work together on, is building out that infrastructure across the British Isles so we can avoid that range anxiety. Great questions, thank you.
There was also a question about where that electricity comes from, about what happens on days when it's not windy and the sun doesn't shine. Yeah. You partly answer that, I guess, with it stored in batteries.
Yeah. And there has been a massive investment in storage. I think in terms of renewables, wind and solar, the investors that made billions did so because they invested 6-7 years ago in that, got in at the right time. The next wave of millionaires, billionaires in terms of renewables has been in storage, because you're absolutely right. There's days when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. What do you do? And increasingly, we've always had, for hundreds of years, we've had energy storage in reservoirs. We let the water down through the pumps when there's a big demand for electricity on the Friday tea time, and then we quietly pump it back up quietly on 3 o'clock on a Sunday morning. We're going to need more and more storage. So that's going to be reservoirs, pump storage. It's going to be physical storage. So people are using weights in mine shafts now. So dropping the weight to release kinetic energy when we need it, and sort of bringing it back up when we don't. And then there's going to be battery storage, but on a huge scale, in the way that we've got batteries for cars and homes now. But battery storage has been the next frontier. Again, I'm looking at all the numbers coming out of people like Bloomberg New Energy Forum, and they're showing that within 2-3 years' time, we're going to have an energy storage system to support the renewables that we've got. As fossil fuels drops off and renewables goes up, storage tracks with it. I'm not overly concerned about that, but you're absolutely right to raise the question.
Okay, we have a couple of pandemic-related questions. One is saying with the pandemic, more people are working from home, and so using much less fuel in consuming for commuting. Do you think that will stick after the pandemic's over? And somebody else saying, I've read that pandemics are likely to become more likely or frequent due to a combination of climate change and population growth. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, so again, wonderful questions. I mean, the first one on home working, I'm working with lots of different business clients at the moment across lots of different parts of the economy. The only thing that connects them all is saying we're going to use the office less. You know, people are not going to fly around the world on business travel as much. They're not going to drive around on business travel. They're not going to get on the train as much. Just ain't going to happen. Now, whether that's a 10%, 20%, 30%, 40% reduction, don't know at this stage, but there's going to be substantial change driven by a different way of working post-pandemic. The question about more pandemics is a brilliant one, because I should have linked together what's happening in terms of the biodiversity crisis and the COVID crisis. As we shrink the amount of space that animals have got to live in and increase the amount that we've got, which in effect is happening, we rub up against nature much more quickly. Diseases spread, bats bite human beings that bring something that was in the animal kingdom across the human world, and we get pandemics. It's going to happen more frequently. And again, I talked very briefly about what's happening in the meat industry and the pressure it's under, both in terms of a plant-based diet and fermented alternatives that will come out of a laboratory one day. A lot of the meat industry struggles through COVID for two reasons. One is that workers packed together in meat plants have been getting COVID from each other and therefore work. Second is increasingly concerned about the hygiene standards in those global supply chains of meat. And right back to the wet markets that you see in other countries as well. So the meat, where meat industry meets biodiversity loss, meets pandemic, is a really interesting melting pot. And it's going to stimulate and drive so much change. And a lot of the startup companies I spoke about coming along with meat alternatives, they're going to do really well.
Okay, following on about COVID, I mean, do you think that half the high street is going to go out of business as a result of COVID lockdowns? And there's another question about the high street in terms of how do we balance the argument of consuming to keep businesses going, but they're not consuming to save the planet. There's an economic. Yeah.
Such good questions, a profound one. So the high street was already under huge pressure before COVID. Even in a relatively wealthy town like Henley, you could see that businesses were finding it harder and harder to survive in terms of competing with Amazon. So if you offered hospitality pre-COVID, great. You know, people wanted a day out. Now it's market town, came out to the weekend or in the evening. Suddenly COVID has taken away hospitality, and these high streets are looking really difficult places to be. Now we'll get through COVID, we'll get vaccinated, we'll go back out there, but people have got used to online shopping now. Now people ask me if online shopping has more or less of an impact. It doesn't really make a difference. Whether we drive to a shop to do our shopping, or a van, increasingly an electric van it will be, brings it to our home, not much difference. If it's got a carbon footprint as a product, it's the same, however you buy it. The true challenge is socioeconomic. And I think an awful lot of businesses, and you can see it in the clothing sector, where a number of very large businesses, Debenhams, House of Fraser, Arcadia have hit the wall. There's going to be an awful lot of people go to the wall. Some of that business will be picked up by alternatives, the Amazons, the Boohoo's, the ASOS's of this world, selling online. But I think people are going to recalibrate the amount of stuff that they actually need. You know, we've grown up in this 40-year cycle where in many ways, for many people, aspiration was just owning more stuff. I'm hoping that goes and people go back to owning quality, buying what they need. If they do have meat, it's a treat for the family once a week, as it used to be 40, 50, 60 years ago. So I think people will become more considered about what they consume. They'll just spend the money differently. So inevitably, I've just talked about a 40-year cycle of capitalism coming to an end. There's going to be a huge attrition rate of businesses that go to the wall. And I'm sad for some of them, and some of them have just sleepwalked into it. but they'll be replaced by better alternatives. And I showed you examples of who those may be. So I think there's just a huge sustainability shakeout coming. But my final point is, where you can, shop local. And I know we're all tempted at late at night to push a button and get it delivered to our front door by a courier. Don't do that every time. Try and support your high street as well.
Which fits in, but there's a question about food miles. We used to, in the old days, only eat things that were seasonal, grown locally. Now we expect to have fruit and veg all year round. Should we?
So the only time that food miles is really important environmentally is when you fly food in. So if you're flying fresh fruit or fresh flowers in, there is a huge carbon footprint associated with it. If it's come on a boat or a lorry from Spain, it doesn't materially alter the carbon footprint of the overall product. In some ways, using a glass house in the UK to grow the alternative in winter, using fossil fuels, was worse than getting it from Spain grown outdoors in winter with decent sunlight. As you shift to renewables, that becomes less of a problem to heat the greenhouse in the UK. But there's two other things I would add. One is that typically environmental standards in the UK are higher than in most other marketplaces. So inevitably, when something's produced far from here, it's usually produced to a somewhat lower standard. Not always. And I worked for M&S, and M&S drove consistent standards across its global supply chains. But the overall regulation enforcement of policy systems in many of these developing marketplaces producing our goods is just is not as good. And the second, again, is socioeconomic. And this is just it's entirely up to you as to whether you'd rather put your pound in terms of development into Bangladesh, helping Bangladeshi people sort of get out of poverty, or you'd rather keep your pound close to home to support producers and growers in the UK as well. And that, I think that's a personal judgment call as well. But ultimately, what matters is transparency. Again, we had a big push at M&S where we named every factory in the world that we use on a digital map on the website. Most clothing retailers do that. Not many food retailers do it, interestingly. And M&S will tell you that it knows where 7,000 British beef farmers are in the UK that it sources from. Again, it can trace back to each individual cow it uses. It doesn't put the address of the beef farm on the website because for a lot of people, it's not factory. It's a place where they and their family live. So slightly different about putting that in the public domain as information. But hyper transparency about where things are produced and to what standard. Remember my Garnier story, using a phone to put against the product to tell you its embedded carbon before you buy it will only become more prevalent as people want more information to shape how they consume.
But talking about the developing world, there's a question about climate change and biodiversity are global problems. But are some of the solutions only actually things that the rich world can do? If scraping a living is your main concern in life, what changes are that you can do which will care about your water bottle being plastic and so on?
Yeah. So again, I've stood in the middle of the biggest slum in the world in Bangladesh, and I've seen the reality of how hundreds of millions of people around the world live their lives, utterly different from us. And I think that's a good and legitimate point. I think there's a macro response that said Africa in particular has an opportunity to jump ahead of us. So we've spent 50, 60, 70 years putting a centralized fossil fuel energy system in place with giant pylons and power stations. They've got the opportunity to go straight to microgrids for a particular village, cut all the expensive and wasteful infrastructure and just produce energy from the sun where it's required. So they can learn from our mistakes, learn from our innovation and put those in place in an African context in terms of what they do. Again, I look at the plastics pollution when I travel around the developing world. An awful lot of it is because big megacities like Jakarta in Indonesia, Manila in the Philippines, has no infrastructure whatsoever to collect plastic. So I talked about how we were collecting it in the UK, then shipping it off to China, hoping it was being recycled. It wasn't. But at least we collected it. It's not collected in the developing world by and large. And again, it's for nations like the UK, relatively rich countries, the World Bank, the IMF, to fund the infrastructure to help these countries stop having the problems that we've had here. Again, there's a big discussion going on I talked about COP26, this climate conference, about the responsibility of rich countries like ours for all our past carbon emissions that have made us rich. Thank you very much. We're now going to pull the drawbridge up and say to other countries, well, you can't emit anything because it's going to cause this climate change thing. You're going to stay in poverty. Absolutely not. we have got responsibility to pony up some of the money that we've made in the past to compensate countries that are suffering the worst impacts of climate change because of our previous wealth, help them make the low carbon transition as well. So it's a really, really good question. But I do believe that there is an answer that we can help other countries learn from our mistakes, learn from our innovation, and drive different economies more successful ones themselves.
Okay. You were talking there about infrastructure. Here's a very specific question, which is, do you think we should halt HS2?
Really good one. So I think absolutely. So I was never a fan in the, you're basically spending £100 billion on it. And it's good, it'll create tens of thousands of construction jobs. But in a post-COVID world, when commuting, certainly business commuting, which was HS2 was predominantly about, is going to be much reduced. That £100 billion ploughed into brilliant broadband everywhere will be far more beneficial for our economy, our society, our connectivity, and our carbon footprint as well. So I wouldn't, and I look at the damage that high speed 2 is causing in terms of its impact on ancient woodland, for example, and other types of biodiversity. I just wouldn't pursue it.
Okay. Coming towards the end, so this is probably the last question almost. So thank you everybody that's put their questions in. Sorry we haven't been able to answer all of them. But this one is, do you think there should be an amendment to the Companies Act to require businesses to account for social and environmental impacts?
Yes. Now, the answer is yes. Now, whether it's the Companies Act, a new piece of legislation, another piece of legislation, there's devil in that detail. But absolutely, businesses need to be as transparent about their social environmental footprint and what they're doing about it as they are with their financial accounts. And again, I think there's some welcome legislation coming through in the UK that will hit the FTSE 350 and the top 100 pension funds in the UK in terms of carbon disclosure. As the confidence of those businesses in reporting those new metrics grows, it needs to be driven down. And a lot of these big businesses have big UK supply chains anyway. So companies turning over $1 billion, $500 million, 100 million a year, who are supplying to M&S or Tesco's or HSBC, will be driven down that route anyway, because the guy at the top of the value ladder is specifying it. But absolutely, we need public transparency. That's what drives change.
Just in terms of legislation, somebody's asked, is the CEE bill, has actually that gone through Parliament?
So it's a private member's bill. It's queued up in the system now. What we want to do is encourage as many MPs to say, despite the great strides that the UK has made with climate legislation, there is still more to be done. And I mentioned the fact that the CE bill takes responsibility for our overseas footprint, as well as our national footprint. It also links better climate change and nature. We talked about paying farmers to lock up carbon on our behalf, better for the soil, better for the climate. And it also brings in the concept of citizen assemblies. And again, I'm taking part in one on Saturday in Scotland, where 150 lay people can ask you, so-called expert in your field, any question they want to help advise government on the changes that's required. We can't just leave it to national politicians. We need local action. And again, people like Green Henley are really helping drive local change here. I know the Rotary Club are doing a lot in terms of plastics and other environmental issues. So we need both national action and local action, and that's what the bill's trying to do. So if we can encourage our MP and the MPs in the surrounding area to back it, that's brilliant.
Okay, great. That's a good note to stop on. Thank you very much.